So thankful for that. Let's go to Exodus. The book of Exodus. Finally got out of Genesis. I think we will take less than 5 weeks. Was it only 5 weeks in Genesis, or was it 6? It was a while we were in Genesis. I think we'll get through Exodus a little bit faster. But Exodus is really an amazing book. And one of the things that I'm hoping we'll get from this as we look through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is that we will get a better understanding of, one, the law as a covenant, but then also how does the law relate to you and I post-cross? This is one of the big things that you hear. Well, we're not under the law, we're under grace, and that's all Old Testament, and you hear people say this about various things. Well, hopefully as we go through this, especially once we get into Deuteronomy, we'll see this more, is get a better understanding of the wisdom of the law that we can apply today. Because the law, it's really interesting. So if you were to go to a big library somewhere, or if you were to go to a lawyer even, there are all these books on laws. Volume after volume after volume, thousands and thousands of laws and loopholes, and there's case law and everything like that. And part of the reason for that is in our Western mindset, we have to have something told to us specifically. It's like if you tell people you shouldn't. Let's see here. What would be a good example? You shouldn't smoke or chew tobacco. Well, the Bible doesn't say smoking. It doesn't say you shouldn't smoke. It doesn't say tobacco anywhere in there. Well, the Bible doesn't say that. Okay. See, in our Western mindset, we think the Bible that there has to be a specific law for every single thing to determine right and wrong. You see, what God did in His wisdom is He gave 613 laws to the nation of Israel, and through those 613 laws, they could judge on every single matter. Because the laws are given not to be so much just that specific thing. So for instance, one of the commands that God gives is that on the roof of your house, you're supposed to put a battlement around it, a fence around the top of your house. Well, when you have in their culture, they had a flat roof, and they spent a great deal of their time on top of that roof. And that's where, when you had family get-togethers and stuff like that, the houses were small inside, and the barn was inside the house. So, we've had get-togethers out to our place, and generally we try to stay away from the barn for obvious reasons. So they would do those things on top. Well, if you don't have a battlement around it, what's going to happen on a flat roof? Somebody's going to get too close to the edge, and what? They're going to fall over. Well, who's responsible for that? The homeowner. Especially if they don't have that fence around the top to protect people from falling off. And so we could look at that and say, well, that only applies if you have a flat roof and you have parties on the roof of your house. Or you could say that you're responsible for the life of the people on your property. This is why we have no trespassing signs. So our barn is rickety at best, and so we have no trespassing signs there. And the reason we have no trespassing signs there is because we don't want anybody going in this. This is the direction we're going. And so I want us to try to see how this applies to us. Because one of the things we do is we look at the Bible and we think, well, we're in the New Testament era, and so we're just going to focus on the New Testament. But the Old Testament is so rich, and there is such a wealth of wisdom, and it demonstrates for us the mind of God. See, everything that's in the Old Testament is written for our admonition and for our learning. How do we know about God? How do we understand his character? How do we understand his person? How he deals with people? Well, we don't find those things so much in the New Testament writings as much as we do in the Old Testament, where we see it repeatedly how he is constantly dealing with the nation of Israel. And God hasn't changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so that's where these studies become important, is because we're trying to understand who God is, how he deals with his people. And so this is what we're looking at. So the book of Exodus, and the book of Exodus really is the book of redemption. And let's just read here to start off chapter 1, verse 8 through, verse 7. And then we'll read down through verse 16. Verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. You know, in English, that's just sounds like a rough name to have. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. So the book of Exodus, your first blank there, it means a departure. Book of Exodus means a departure or a going out. And it's so named because the book begins with the account of the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt. Genesis, this I thought was interesting, that Genesis ends with a coffin in Egypt. For in Adam all die, and beyond the coffin then we find the Exodus, which pictures for us the resurrection. Exodus is the redemption book of the Old Testament. God establishes in the book of Exodus the plan of redemption in type. It is here where we begin to see the Passover, a lamb being sacrificed for a family, and blood being applied. We find the deliverance from Egypt through the Red Sea. We find the sacrificial system, the worship of the tabernacle. All of this begins in the book of Exodus. So Exodus is the second book of the Pentateuch, also called the Law of Moses, and Jesus attested to the fact of Mosaic authorship. We won't go to those passages, but how do we know that Moses wrote these books? Because Jesus said he did. Well, let's look at a passage. Let's go to Luke 24. Keep your place there, but let's go to Luke 24. And it's interesting, if you do much reading on some of this stuff and look into various commentaries, you'll find there is great debate in the theological world over who actually wrote these books. Whether or not it was really Moses or if it was somebody later who wrote it in Moses' name. Well, Luke 24, notice here verse 44. And he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. And we know from the Hebrew division of the Old Testament, the law of Moses is the 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we'll look at that here now. Let's go back to Exodus. Notice how the book of Exodus begins. It begins with the word now. Okay, now let's go to Leviticus. You'll find as I go through these in my papers that sometimes I begin sentences with the word "and." You know, we were told in school to try to avoid beginning sentences with "and" because it's not really proper. Sometimes you can get away with it, but you don't want to do that. But notice here how Leviticus begins. And. Now let's look over at Numbers. I'll get there. Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. How does it begin? And. Now let's go to Deuteronomy. Now Deuteronomy is a little tricky, but let's get there and see how that begins. Deuteronomy chapter 1. You have to read a couple sentences first, because there's a little bit of an introduction before it actually gets into the book. Deuteronomy begins, "These be the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain over against the Red Sea, between Paran and Tophel, and Laban, and Hazeroth, and Dizahab. There are 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea, and it came to pass." See, verse 3 actually begins the narrative of Deuteronomy. So each of these books, it begins with now or and, which shows us that Genesis to Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, is intended by God to be viewed as one book, one whole message as we go through. And you see there, our conjunction is important. Now here, once Alex is done with his study on dispensationalism in Sunday school, we're going to start a class on how to study the Bible. And as I was going through that and putting stuff together, one of the sections is on focusing on the various words and such like that. One of the things was conjunctions and verbs and nouns and pronouns and various things like that. You have to understand those. And as I'm reading through that, I remember thinking to myself, I remember in junior high thinking, when will I ever use this stuff? Did you ever say that in school? And they're going through all these rules of grammar and punctuation and all this terminology, and you're just sitting there thinking, who is going to use any of this stuff? Use it every single day. It is so important. So our conjunction's important? Absolutely. All these words put ideas together. And so as we look, Genesis ends, but then Exodus begins with now. So what is that? That's a continuation of the narrative. It's just keep moving on. Leviticus begins with and then we get into Numbers, and then we get to Deuteronomy, now. And so there's just this continual moving of the narrative because God intends for it to be one long narrative, not to just be broken up. And so while they were written at various points, it is one long narrative that the Lord is putting together for us. And so the Pentateuch is also called the book of the law of Moses, or the book of Moses. It's generally referred to as being one book or one law. It's not usually referred to as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. It's just referred to as the law or the book of Moses. And so Genesis presented us with the calling out of Abraham and his descendants. Exodus chapter 1 verse 5 tells us that there were 70 people of Jacob's family that go down into Egypt. And it is there in Egypt that God is going to make of them a great nation. A nation numbering upwards of 2 million people to start with. That's a pretty good start. That's a better start than America had at her beginning. But some 2 million people. Notice, go over to Exodus chapter 12. And some of this is kind of the math that we have to do when it comes to the feeding of 5,000. But notice here, Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. It says, "And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men beside children." And he doesn't even mention the women there. So if you have 600,000 men, and then you add at least 600,000 or more women, because remember, they were killing off the men, trying to, and keep the women, so there more than likely would have been more women. And then you figure 600,000 men would have been married, and then however many children they would have had in those families. You're looking at easily upwards of 2 million or more people. And we'll look at more at that when we get to the actual Exodus next week. But that develops in about 350 years is the amount of time that transpires between Genesis and Exodus. And Exodus then presents us with the outcalling, that's your next blank there, the outcalling of God's people, the nation of Israel. It is here we see how they are formed into a nation with a code of laws given by God. Now remember, the part of the reason for the Pentateuch is Israel had been in bondage for 400 years. At least 4 generations without the worship of God. And that was one of the first things that Moses says when he goes to Pharaoh. Let my people go that we can go out into the wilderness and worship the Lord. They weren't allowed to do that when this new king rose up, at least. And so they've been without the worship of the Lord. They've been detached from their God, so to speak. And so part of the reason for the Pentateuch being written is so the people of Israel understand how they are related to their God, and so they know how they are to relate to their God. They're related to Him by covenant. The Abrahamic covenant secures their relationship as the seed of Abraham. But now, as the seed of Abraham, how are we to relate to our Creator? Well, that's exactly the same way it is for us in the New Testament. Why do we have the Bible? It's so we can know how we're related to God and how we can know how we're to relate to God. We're related to Him, again, by covenant, and He's given to us the law of Christ that we're to obey. That is how we relate to Him. That is how we serve Him and follow Him. So this is exactly what's going on with the nation of Israel. He gives them a code of laws. He gives them a place of meeting, and both of which, the laws and the tabernacle, distinguish them as a nation from every other nation around them. In fact, that was part of the purpose. I mean, we look at some of the laws that were given to the nation of Israel, and it's like, really? Not even mixing cotton and linen together? And you can't put the two together? I mean, what was the purpose of that? It was so the people would look at him and say, what other nation has God so close? It was so they could be a testimony to the nations around them. The laws, the place of meeting, their manner of worship, all of it separates them from the world around them. In His dealings with the nation of Israel, we see that God expects obedience from His people. We don't think that way too much, do we? We think about it with our kids. Right? And we look at our kids and we expect obedience, especially when they're little. We expect obedience. But yet then when we grow up and we're no longer kids anymore, kind of think we have the right then to now we can make our own choices. And yeah, I know that's what the Bible says, but this is what I would rather do. Well, God expects obedience from us just as much as He expects from His people in any other generation. He expects us. He wasn't just interested in cutting down trees to make the paper. You know, He's not wasting ink here. He put down everything that He had put down on purpose because He wants us to know how we are to please Him and to obey Him. And so He expects obedience from us. but he is also demonstrating that he is faithful to his covenants. Exodus further develops the doctrine of redemption by blood. That's your next blank. Redemption by blood, as God redeems the people of Israel from bondage in Egypt. The Passover and the Red Sea crossing are illustrative of redemption and deliverance. Christ is pictured in the Passover as a sacrificial lamb, and later pictured in the tabernacle as God dwelling with us. John chapter 1, verse 14, he came into his own. Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That's the word I was thinking of. We also see a picture of him in the high priest who makes intercession for us. So now the Exodus. Notice here that it has always been the plan of God to eliminate the seed. That was the plan from the very beginning. Oppression and extermination of Israel has been high on Satan's priority list. We see his attempt to eliminate Israel at the beginning of the book. We see from the very beginning there's going to be enmity between the seeds in Genesis chapter 3, and that has been going on. Cain kills Abel. We find it going on even here that Satan is trying to eliminate the people. Now notice here in verse number 8 again, it says, there arose, chapter 1 verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Now this puzzled me for some time, because the Egyptians are known for being very meticulous in their historical records. They draw it all over the place. This is what the hieroglyphics are and all the pictures and stuff on the pyramids and everything. They record everything that's going on. So how in the world does a king rise up that does not know who Joseph is or the God of Joseph? How is that even possible? Well, it seems as though Stephen gives us a little bit of an indication in Acts chapter 7. If you notice there, under a new king, Acts chapter 7, verse 18, as Stephen is recounting this for the nation, he says, till another king arose which knew not Joseph. He says, another king. Now in the Greek, there's two words for another. One is allos, which means another of the same kind, or there is heteros, another of a different kind. So, if we think of people, my wife would be an allos, because in the sense of she is, Wayne would be an allos because he's another human. Am I getting this? Yeah, of the same kind. We're both men. Well, I'm not a biologist. Or there's heteros, another of a different kind. So my wife would be heteros, another of a different kind. She's another people, but she's a different kind. Or maybe I'm a different kind. Maybe that would be better to say. And so the word Stephen uses here is heteros. It's another of a different kind. So it seems that there is another kind of king that rises up in Egypt. And Isaiah confirms this in Isaiah 52:4. For thus saith the Lord God, my people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause. Isaiah seems to indicate that there was an Assyrian king, an Assyrian pharaoh in Egypt at this time that was oppressing the people. Now, what all the significance is of that, I don't know, other than the fact to say is it just puzzled me for so many years that a pharaoh rises up in Egypt who doesn't know who Joseph was when he saved the entire nation, and somehow he doesn't know this. Well, the fact that he's not an actual Egyptian, he's an Assyrian king. That helps explain it for me, at least. But what we see here going on is he fears the number of the children of Israel, because they're having babies like rabbits, basically, and so he tries with affliction, we're going to put so much oppression on them, they're just not going to want to have anything to do with that. They're going to be too busy for anything else. Well, that didn't work. And so now the next step is, well, let's eliminate them. Kill the boys and keep the women. And the purpose of that is so the women could marry the Egyptian boys and just be assimilated and dissolved within the people of Egypt. That's the purpose. This is exactly what Satan tries doing back in Genesis chapter 6. Remember the whole deal with the sons of God and daughters of men. Taking God's people, mingling them in with the lost, the ungodly of the world, trying to assimilate them. This is going to happen later in Israel's 40-year journey. They're going to try once again. This is the whole thing in Numbers with the doctrine of Balaam and getting the women of Moab to stand out there on the road. And, well, you get your women out there and the men of Israel will take to them like white on rice, and you won't have to worry about it. God will judge them and He'll destroy them. You won't even have to worry about it. Well, so is that a good idea? Not at all. What has God established for us previously throughout this that we've noticed several times about God is that God is a God of separation. He wants His people kept separate from the world. And so we're going to see again, because this is through this process that Moses comes to the top. And he begins to become now the focal point of this. So in chapters 2 through 4, we have God delivering Moses. And Moses' life revolves around 3 phases or 3 periods of 40 years each. 120 years. You know, that's a pretty good long life. And I don't know if I would want to live that long, because usually when you live that long, most everybody else you know and love and care about has died. But I guess it might not be so bad if you're serving the Lord. But I don't think Moses wanted at least 40 of those years to live a few times. But his first 40-year period is spent in the palace of Pharaoh. That's your blank there. And I want you to notice, let's go over to the book of Hebrews to read about this. So he grows up in Pharaoh's palace. But when he turns 40, something happens. Now, it's really interesting in the account in Exodus, because they're throwing the babies into the Nile River, and Moses' mother notices that there's something different about this child. She still puts him in the river, only she's going to make a basket, pitch it about, so seal it so it'll float on the water. And I tell you, she must have been a woman of faith, because, there's some pretty big crocodiles in the Nile. There's animals that will eat stuff like that. And sends them out into the water. And then sends her daughter to watch. And we know the story. Moses ends up in the area of Pharaoh's daughter, and she takes him up. But, and so he's raised for 40 years under the authority of Pharaoh. But what's really interesting is his mother gets him back until he's weaned. She comes in to be a wet nurse for Moses. How convenient is that? Here's this Hebrew woman that just happens to be able to breastfeed. Would you like her to feed the baby for you? And do you think she ever talked to him as he's growing up about the things of the Lord? What she knew? Well, apparently she did. Because notice here in Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 23, because he didn't learn it from Pharaoh. But notice here, verse 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for one day there was going to come a final deliverer for the nation of Israel. And he says, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Let's go over to the book of Acts for a moment. One of the things that we see as we put this together is that Moses hits this period of time at 40 years old, that no longer is he going to live in Pharaoh's house. He knows he's different than the rest. And there is a period of time in which he goes out and actually lives with the people. He forsakes all of his inheritance, all of his rights as a child of Pharaoh, which really upsets Pharaoh. But then something's going to happen that kind of be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Notice here in Acts chapter 7, this is Stephen's account. Acts chapter 7 and verse 20, and this might be all the farther we get today. I think it'll be a good place to stop. But Acts chapter 7 here, verse 20. In which time Moses was born and was exceeding fair and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart. And that's really interesting how that's worded. It came into his heart. Where did that come from? It came from God. God put it into his heart. And what did he do? To visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So he's out with them. Now this doesn't just mean that he went out to say hi to somebody. He went out and he was actually with them. He's observing them. He's living with these people, partaking in the work that they're doing. And seeing one of them suffer, verse 24, suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. So he understood his purpose. He goes out to visit his children, the people of Israel. He understands God has a purpose for him to deliver the nation. Now, this is something you don't really get at this point in the book of Exodus. But Stephen's revealing to us here that Moses, when he goes out and kills that Egyptian, he has the purpose of proving to the people of Israel, God has called me to deliver this nation and to take us back to the promised land. And so he keeps going here. For he supposed his brethren, verse 26, and the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. And when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. And when Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses trembled and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people, which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. Now notice here, this Moses, whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out. After that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses, which said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear. Now he's speaking of Christ. Now one of the things that's interesting, Jesus gives a parable about a king who goes into a far country to receive a kingdom for himself. And as he goes, the people send a delegate ahead of him to the emperor to say, we will not have this man to rule over us. And so the king goes, he gets his kingdom, comes back, and then destroys the people who would not have him to rule over him. Stephen is making a parallel here, and as you read through this account that Stephen gives, he is talking to the nation of Israel about their constant failure. God sends somebody, you refuse him, and then later on you finally make it right. God sends somebody, you refuse him, later on you make it right. God sends somebody, you refuse him, and later on you make it right. And just this constant pattern over and over. Moses, he says, is the same pattern, and what is he a pattern of? He is a pattern of Christ who is to come. He is to be a pattern of that prophet. So Moses comes, well, who made you a ruler and a judge? And so they reject him, he flees, he comes back as a ruler and a deliverer. And so Moses says, this is that Moses that said unto the children of Israel, A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me, him shall ye hear. It's the exact same thing he's talking about.